Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Tree Actions, the Human Forestry Podcast. And with me, as always, my trusted companion and technical advisor, Anthony Tony Tressel. Morning, Anthony. Tony. I should probably just call you Tony, but
yeah, just call me Tony.
Your
my mom and the police called me Anthony.
Yeah, and your email says it, so I get mixed up. Oh no, your email. Anyways, and our guest today, which I believe is hailing to us from the beautiful Pacific Northwest region, Mr. Craig Bachman, who I'm looking forward to have on the show because you kind of have a radio voice.
Well, thank you very much. It's good to be here. I'll give you the extra radio voice today, just special for you, Dwayne.
That's awesome. So, one of the things that some people find frustrating about our podcast, and if we ever get syndicated, we'll have to probably change it. But we just really jump right into the question, and sometimes a lot of our listeners may not know who we're actually talking to, and it kind of comes out in the podcast itself. And we haven't broken tradition from that yet. And but sometimes I think about it. So, but nevertheless, Craig, if you would, please share with us the first memory you have where you can recall having a connection to a tree or trees.
It's funny, I should be better prepared knowing this question was going to be asked. I grew up, let's call it in a rural suburb of Chicago, Illinois.
Okay.
And I was very fortunate to be a kid who got to play in the woods.
Mm-hmm.
We lived on, I wouldn't call it a horse farm, but a rural suburban property, and had a few acres for horses and an acre or two set aside of sort of just woods, not a woodlot in a harvest sense, but just sort of an unmaintained treed area.
Mm-hmm.
And I was certain that I was Daniel Boone. I was 100% certain that was the life. Daniel Boone, Huckleberry Finn, whatever it might be, playing in the woods, playing in the creek. I had my hatchet. I had my Swiss Army knife that I definitely cut myself with multiple times. Building forts. None of the trees were really climbing trees. I wish they were. But it was an opportunity to be away and to be among trees and be among nature and to just sort of live that boy's life kind of experience. I mean, that's my first recollection in the forest floor covered in woodland violets and, black walnuts on the ground that you'd smash with a brick and, nibble away the insides, and grapevine growing up trees and, nothing spectacular or special or ancient, but just this wooded hideout play area. And that was normal for me as a kid. I now live in the city of Seattle, and I don't know what it's like to grow up and be 8 years old in the city. And that was my first recollection, is just playing among the trees. And then I had friends who lived sort of in the small town nearby, and they had climbing trees in their yards. But yeah, Daniel Boone. I don't know if anybody knows who Daniel Boone is anymore, but that's what I had.
Well, I Daniel Boone was a big man, but the bear was bigger.
Yeah, that was my first recollection.
And then the bear scared him up a tree. Well, how did you hear about Daniel Boone? Was that a story that you read or that was told to you?
I use Daniel Boone probably as the generic sort of American frontier reference.
Okay.
I definitely couldn't quote the Daniel Boone story to you, but it was just, it's kind of how I imagined myself. I imagined that, raccoon skin cap, right?
Right.
And just sort of that frontier, exploratory, wild nature kind of feeling.
Yeah.
That's just what I imagined.
Yeah, and wasn't there Davy Crockett in there somewhere?
Yeah, absolutely. Who I also couldn't tell you anything about either, but sort of that American mythology feeling.
Yeah, were they synonymous of a sort? Not synonymous, but they're the same era, weren't they? Or was one
Contemporary,
Disney?
maybe.
Was Davy Crockett Disney version of Daniel Boone? Maybe.
No, I think they're both real people, but definitely Disneyfied. I'm sure mythologized to
Yeah,
a
yeah,
degree, right?
absolutely. Oh yeah, myth. That was something I would talk a lot about is myths. You like talking about myths. Um, at what point did you make a connection that with trees then, where you realized, oh, I like trees, or I'm connecting with the tree, whether it be climbing or where did that occur in your life path?
Yeah, I got into arboriculture from mostly a climbing interest. As you two both know, and some people who know me have heard, I had another career, right? I call it my
Yeah.
past life, and I decided I wasn't going to do that anymore, and I wanted to do something that was more physical, more outdoors. I didn't want to do something that was industrial per se. And I had gone to school for environmental science, and I really got into arboriculture because of an interest in being aloft, an interest in climbing. And I think it actually took me quite a while into this, number of years into this profession to really gain a deep appreciation for trees. I didn't get into it from the tree hugger side.
Huh.
I just worked at sort of, general tree care companies at first. I think my interest in trees really has developed, particularly in the last few years. And that seems crazy now being a professional arborist for 14 years. But I think my interest and connection to them has deepened, seeing what is happening in my city over the last now almost decade that I've lived in Seattle, and how public attitudes toward trees are so diverse, unfortunately, so diverse. And such a large portion of our population is dismissive of them, views them as weeds, views them as impediments, views them as obstacles that are just in the way of progress, in the way of housing, in the way of parking. They're messy on the roof, whatever it might be. Mm-hmm. And I think if we were to say passion for trees, interest in trees, appreciation of them has grown as I have seen others are less interested. I had the opportunity to be interviewed for a local NPR story about trees and development, maybe 60 days ago. And one of the things that I shared with the reporter was, we seem to think there is some consensus, at least out here on the left coast, around the environment and climate change and trees and their importance. But that is not the case. People do not value trees the way we think they do, the way we assume they do. I think for the majority, people are dismissive of them and a lack of appreciation for them. Trees are messy. I hear it every day. And I think I become a stronger advocate for trees and more protective of them every time I hear that. And I become somewhat less interested in people. Somebody pointed out to me that plants were on this planet, woody plants also were on this planet long before humans were, long before mammals were. And really it is we who are on their planet rather than them on ours. And they would be far better off without us.
You mentioned a couple times, you used the word profession. And, not everyone says that with such conviction. And I'm curious if you would, there's people that are in this business that have been in it a long time that wouldn't even consider it that or even realize it's that. How did you get to the place where you're like, you have this, like you say it with conviction, the profession? How did that journey, how did you get to the place where you feel professional in tree care?
That's a great question. In one way that connects back to somebody, actually, I think both of you would know, Desiree Litchfield, who passed a few years ago. Mm-hmm. And Desiree always used to sort of beat me up anytime I would say industry. And he said, we're not an industry, we're a profession. Right? This is something where we strive for excellence and knowledge, and where we advise people. We're not just doers, we are thinkers. And this idea of it being a profession as well as behaving in a professional manner, maybe are two sides of the same coin, but they're not the same thing. That tree care, I prefer to say tree care rather than tree work. Tree care is it is a calling in a way. It is an expertise. It is a something that where we are pursuing knowledge in a lifelong way. I think about the profession of the law, right? Practicing the law as an attorney or practicing medicine. In many ways, we are practicing arboriculture, and it is a living, breathing thing that evolves over time rather than something that can be known and implemented. Right? We pursue it with curiosity and with humility and with passion, rather than simply, taking a plan and implementing it. And that's what makes it a profession to me. And then one can behave professionally or not in pursuit of that. And that's sort of a different subject.
Right. I wonder if, as you were saying that, it came to my mind, if, profession has something to do with doing things with living things. A lot of the professions you mentioned, even lawyers, like without people, they wouldn't have a profession, right? And of course, surgeons, doctors, whatever, general practitioners, maybe more so. Obviously, and they probably would be the first to tell you that no one person is the same, where they're all very unique, and the books don't have all the answers. Which anyone that's been in arboriculture for any length of time, I think would the longer you've been at, the more you realize that to be very true.
You mentioned several situations of caring for living things, and the one that I have thought about recently as most analogous to what we do in arboriculture is being a veterinarian. And that we are caring for a living thing. And my wife Joanna and I, we don't have kids, we have dogs. And I don't think of myself as owning our dogs. Just as I don't think of myself as owning the trees at my home. I think of myself as being a caregiver, a steward, a support to them, who sometimes needs to make very difficult decisions. Yeah. And the idea that we are stewarding trees at our properties, right? We could go way down the private property rabbit hole, but if we were to look at it briefly, this idea of trees being a community, a global resource that happens to be hyper locally important to me on this rectangle of property that I'm supposedly owning and paying for, right. Where the costs and risks associated with it are hyper local, but the benefits and value of it, even in a microscopic way, are global. And that we are responsible for these living organisms and sometimes have to make very hard choices.
I like that analogy, in the sense that it removes the anthropomorphic problem which can be problematic, assigning too many human qualities to trees or any inanimate object. Yet there's no question a strong attachment, and pets make that analogy very, 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 very well. They have, their own their own mind or their own thought. I have a dog that's very loyal to me, and that's become a pretty major part of my life. I didn't necessarily know it was going to go that way, but he's probably my main companion, really, in a lot of ways. And so I like that analogy of veterinarian. I never thought of that as, I often think of doctors, but it never quite fits. So I think you're right. I think that does fit better. What do you think, Tony? Does that, have you thought of it that way before?
I haven't thought of it way before, but it does fit pretty well, because a tree is a animate object with a, purpose to, separate from mine, right?
Yeah.
It's, tree would be there without me, right? I just happen to be in connection with it. Same with animals, and it fits really well because my wife's dog hates me, and I think all trees hate me too. So maybe that makes it even better.
Well, it's the one thing about the analogy that and I I know that there's people that would carefully tread on this, and that is the sentientism or the connection. Like, I know there's absolutely connection in a forest or in a tree, even, when you're in amongst them or in a tree, a big tree, particularly an old tree, there's something about that energy, vibration or field. And I don't know. And I mean, I think it's actually even been measured, that there's something there, some type of energy that we can sense or feel. Certainly chemically we feel it and so on. With a dog, dogs particularly, I mean, they look at you, right? Their eyes are completely, they've evolved to be so connective that they go right to the heart, right? They know exactly how to tug whereas a tree doesn't look, I don't look at a tree gazingly, it doesn't melt my heart in the same way as a dog would. But nevertheless, there's something there. And that's the hard part to put your finger on. And not everyone feels that, for sure. But not everyone feels that even with pets. Does that bring up anything or resonate at all with you?
I think it does. And what you got me thinking about is sort of this forest versus landscape environment. I think of, if we were to draw a parallel, right? I could think of a forest tree as being like a wild animal, right? Mm-hmm. A wolf, a coyote, whatever it might be, right? And I think of a domesticated dog, perhaps like a tree in a landscape, right? Not in its natural environment, but it doesn't diminish its value, its sentience, its whatever it is. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say that I think trees are sentient. I think they communicate in biochemical ways, absolutely, and they're far more sophisticated than we will ever fully appreciate.
Yeah.
But that, a wolf, if I make an analogy, right? A wolf doesn't need me, right? Just as the tree in the forest doesn't need an arborist. Right. But my dogs, I guess we have two dogs, for whom we have taken responsibility for, right? Yeah. I will be your dog and you will be my people. And we have a different interaction, a different relationship to them, just like I think we do with trees in our landscapes.
Yeah.
And a colleague of mine, Doug Smith, said, and probably stole from somebody else, the idea that arborists facilitate the relationship between people and trees. Mm-hmm. And in, let's call them managed or environments where humans and trees need to coexist. And that care, that responsibility we have to them, I think it's incumbent on us to not be dismissive, right? And that "this tree is messy" comment, quotes around that, in my mind, that's a dismissive attitude. That's like, well, my dog sheds. Well, no kidding, right? Of course he does. And you could get a doodle, right? You could absolutely get a doodle, but that's a little bit like the highly manipulated, potted plant. So I don't know where the heck this analogy is going, but I think our relationship to trees needs to evolve. Otherwise, we're going to prioritize other things. We'll get rid of them, and in the end, we will get rid of ourselves.
I agree, and I think it goes beyond. It goes beyond. Like, I think, I'm going to step way out here, and this is going to get maybe as weird as we've gotten on the show yet. But, people and their animals that have really strong bonds and connections, and the care they'll give them is admirable and above and beyond, and yet the care we would give our neighbor or one another often would pale in comparison, and so not only can we draw this analogy to how we care and interact with trees and all the environment, but what about each other even, they're getting to that topic of the human forest, which is, our catchphrase for this podcast. Right. And it was partly the reason of it is, we are all connected people, like a forest is, and we impact one another, whether we like it or not, and how that interaction grows and develops, evolves, is nurtured, is fertilized, is cared for. We get a different product, we get a different resultant, but, and for whatever reason, when you were talking about the caring of the pets like that, and the forest animals versus the domesticated animals, which, there's multiple parallels. I think about horses, dogs, cats, whatever, cows. The list goes, pet pig, whatever. You can draw so many analogies. The whole adopt a tree program model switches into my brain. You're going to be approved to get a tree. Anyways, I said a lot there. And it seems like these days there's a lot more talk about the connectedness of humans together and that nurturing that as well.
Well, you reminded me of a few different things. There's a great book, and I'll butcher the title, I'm sure, but I think it's called A Short History of Nearly Everything by Bill Bryson. Really excellent, entertaining book. I think all of his writing is great. But one of the things he brings up, talking through all kinds of things, the universe and how light works and gravity, and then the evolution of life on the planet and the evolution of the atmosphere and trees and volcanoes and extinction events, yada, yada, yada. But he gets to this idea of human evolution and shares in there this idea that sometimes we think of humans as the ultimate end result of evolution, right? That this is all what it's been working toward. And maybe that is actually not the case, right? Maybe we are just one organism on this planet, and we happen to be a particularly damaging, detrimental one. and maybe we are a parasite rather than the epitome of evolution. But anyway, where I'm going with that is this dismissiveness of trees, putting ourselves first. I think there's a lot to be said in the human forest, right? Mm-hmm. And do we put ourselves first, or do we see those people, those things around us as having intrinsic value? Or are we, what is the term, solipsistic, right? Where we think that we are what matter and everything else around us is irrelevant, or that everything else around us is some imaginary dream thing. That's deep stuff there. But it occurs to me that when we look at other things and say that's not important, but what bothers me is, maybe we're missing something. And getting back to the dog issue, what a dog trainer we worked with said, remember, dogs make dog choices. And I think about trees, and remember, trees are going to be trees, just as people are going to be people. Yeah. But saying, well, this tree is messy, gets debris on my roof, like, well, no kidding. What'd you think it was going to do? And I have a developer friend, a builder friend, and he called me out, to see about doing some clearance pruning. I said, yeah, it's a shame the tree and the house are so close together. And he's like, yeah, maybe that tree shouldn't be there. I said, well, maybe you should have built a house somewhere else. and can we see the idea that if a tree and a house are close together, and the tree's been there 60 years and the house has been there 60 days, that maybe there was a decision made wrong somewhere along the way, and it wasn't 60 years ago. Yeah. And I'm intrigued by the idea that a tree and house are too close together, and we blame the tree.
Yeah,
that seems funny to me.
It is funny. Well,
I told you there were two things I remembered before we go on. There was a great essay written by, you remember Tom Clancy, who wrote a lot of those sort of Cold War, spy thriller books. He wrote a series of nonfiction essays, one of them around nuclear weapons. And how this connects is, he said, people say that, with nuclear weapons, we'll destroy the world. Well, no, we'll just destroy ourselves. The world will go on just fine. And I think about our choices regarding the environment, and trees the same way. That yes, we may kill a bunch of trees, but in the end, we're just destroying ourselves. They will be here long after we are gone.
Yeah. Well, and then, in some it's funny because the lesson's been learned, so to speak. If you go back to, the great, what's the word should I use here? War machine or whatever, like there's always been military's been a part of human evolution, right? And who has the biggest stick, the biggest power? Well, literally ships and the oceans was what I would call now, I think it's moved to the sky. The sky is now, who controls the sky controls a lot, right? Especially with the way drones have gone. But back in the day, it was the ships, right? Which came from the wood. Because, we hadn't evolved to have metal and all the other materials we got now, which kept us out of the air anyway, right? So here we had, and the devastation that occurred as a result of building those ships and the magnitude, like the clearing and the effect that had on, it's one of the reasons the Black Forest was one of the first forests to be preserved, right? Because it threatened because of industrial and the war machine of shipbuilding. So we know that it's, there's consequences to removing too much of these materials. And yet, and I'm not saying we're still doing it, but I don't know that the message always gets carried through, or that we forget. We so easily forget what it was like, even in our own lives. You make some big changes and you forget about how bad it was and why you needed to change what you needed to change.
Well, I think we forget, among other things, that we live in a closed system. And whether we think about the planet that way or we think about our communities that way, and that the choices we make, right? If we go to ripples in a pond, for instance, we can create ripples that are positive or negative, and those start bouncing around, and they will come back to us one way or another. But if we imagine, whether it's in our choices around resource use or in our behavior towards others, if we imagine it's an open system and those ripples will just go on forever and dissipate and go away, rather than coming back, maybe we misunderstand how the world works, whether that is physically or emotionally or psychologically or whatever it is.
Yeah. I just want to circle back to the profession thing again, because, really, I think a lot of this hovers on that topic. That is professionalism, right? Being able to consider all these factors and then acting either prudently, responsibly, or I think accountability really is what it is, isn't it?
Yeah, and what is our, let's use the word complicity in the choices that are made about tree management. And I'm going to be careful here on what I say, but I for a while did a fair bit of consulting and ended up doing some development consulting. And I've decided I'm going to step away from that because I kept feeling like the tree undertaker. And all I was doing code interpretation and letting builders know which trees they were allowed to remove rather than helping them to protect and preserve trees. And that's a function of how city code is written, I'm going to guess, in many municipalities. But I felt very complicit in the, let's use the word deforestation of our environment, right, on an urban setting. I was just chatting with a couple of other local small business owners who have companies that are similar to mine, and we were all sort of chatting about how the decline of overall tree health in the city has led to a need for removals, for risk mitigation, et cetera, et cetera. And what do we take on? What do we not? What are we willing to be a part of? What are we not? And in my mind, the rubber hits the road, and there's three kinds of tree removals. There are trees that, for really obvious risk-related reasons, probably cannot be retained in their current site. There are trees that could go either way. Well, yeah, there's a way to preserve this. May or may not be an outcome that everybody's going to be happy with, but we could keep something and or remove it. And there are those where there's nothing wrong with the tree, and maybe it's a little bit inconvenient, or maybe it's messy on your roof, or maybe you just want to remove it because of your own personal preferences. And the question is, in that last category, do I want to be part of that? And to the professional aspect of it, to the integrity aspect of it, when do we say, yes, this is allowable, yes, this is legal, but I personally want nothing to do with it? Telling somebody, I don't want to remove your tree, and they look at you like your head just spun around 3 times and sprouted carrots for horns. What do you mean? I'm going to pay you. Why don't you want to do this? It's like they think you're insane, and maybe you should be committed because you don't want to take part in something that you don't feel really is justifiable. Whether it's legal or not is a different question. I don't know quite how that comes down on professionalism, because if it's legal, should you do it? there's a whole philosophy course in there, Tony.
Well, it's very. I've thought about that along those lines, and it's. I find it the older you get, and the more established you get, the easier it is to make those choices. And I think we have to be very careful to remember not everyone's at the same place, and they need to. We need to learn things in our own way, in our own journey, and then there's just fact of life things like I don't own a house. I'd like a house. Haven't paid off my car. I would like to maybe start a bit. There's a lot of things that's a means to that end. And then you get to that stage. And now you can start making, you know what? I don't like doing that anymore. But we need to be careful not to, because someone's got to do it. And it doesn't mean, this because they're not, and I'm not saying you're suggesting this, but it's you could easily make someone feel like you're implying they don't have values like you do because and the only reason is they're not at the stage of life you're at. I've tried to remember that myself, or I've thought about that, because what makes me, I used to not have any qualms about it. When in my 20s, when I first started, the bigger the removal, the better. I never thought about it from this perspective. I'm the same person now, but I have a whole different set of lenses to look at things through. But sorry, I answered it before and you'd asked Tony to comment. I'd like to hear that. I kind of cut you off, Tony. Sorry.
No, I think, when you start to talk about what makes a profession, what's the difference between a job, for lack of a better term, and a profession is, I think it's that blending of not only the physical activity, but the science behind it, like the academic end of it. There's a lot of that in tree care that a lot of people don't see. Anyone can run a chainsaw, but where do you make the cut, right? And then I think you really get into it when you start to, this discussion for the last 20 minutes, half hour, it's a moral and ethical discussion, right? Yeah. Just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? And never say never, never say always, you go back and forth with those things. And it does come down to a lot of, you're right, Dwayne. You're like, people like, well, if I don't take a tree down, they're just going to pay somebody else to do it, so I might as well take it. But it's like, yeah, but now we're talking a moral or an ethical decision. And, maybe you're talking a professional reputation, which brings that word back around again. Because there's been points that I've seen, with my brother's company when he started out, that he turned down big removals that he would have made some money on, just because it wasn't the right thing to do. There was no reason to do it. And he didn't want to be associated with that type of tree work. Right. Now, there's also been jobs where, we've, in the scope of 400 removals for a development project, we've taken down 2 or 3 really nice trees. And, so where do you draw the line in that? Right. I think it's a question that you have to answer for yourself, but I think there's guidelines out there. With any philosophical discussion, you have to be careful. You could rationalize anything, right? You can rationalize anything if you put your mind to it. So there has to be guideposts, right? And deciding on those guideposts, I think, is something as a profession we're just starting to understand. And I think those guideposts are different for a landscape tree or the domesticated animal, in the analogy, as they are for a forest, the wild animal. Mm-hmm. The guideposts are different. And then finding those to work within, well, that if you're doing that for your job, well, I think you're a professional.
Right.
Tony, I don't think there's any right answer to it. I think of it as being, and Dwayne, you alluded to this idea of it changing over time, and not necessarily that the circumstance changes, but how we relate to it, how we think about it. Is it do I come at this from some position of privilege? Yeah, maybe. But Tony, to your point, when you start a company early on, you quickly build a reputation for what you're willing to do and what you're not willing to do. And rather than using removals, let's do hedges, right? If you start doing hedges and you do a lot of hedges, guess what you're going to get? You're going to get a lot more hedges, because people who have hedges seem to know people who have hedges. Just as people who want trees removed, regardless of conditions, circumstance, etc., seem to know people who want trees removed. I don't quite know how that happens, but it seems to be the case. And we build reputations for ourselves as individuals, relating to other people, just as we build relationships, or I should say reputations, for our companies. And if we are the company that will do whatever you pay us to do, that reputation will precede us. as opposed to if we build a reputation as a company that provides good input and has particular guideposts. I think Tony used that term, that we make decisions within or between. I think that reputation precedes us as well, and it helps us to avoid ending up in circumstances that are grossly outside of that, right? And the funny analogy is, if you don't want to do dishes, just drop a few. Nobody will ask you to do them anymore. And the more I turn down work I don't want to do, the less frequently I get asked to do it.
Yeah. The law of attraction or distraction. I don't know, something.
Detraction.
Yeah.
Something
The
you
law
said,
of
Craig,
distraction. I think I resemble that comment.
something you said, Craig, piqued me. It's like, and I agree with you, there is no right answer, but I think a better way to look at it is there are a lot of right answers. There's no single right answer. And it's important to remember there are many spectacularly wrong answers too, so there are many, many paths to mastery, right? But something I have to explain to my students when I teach here at Longwood is, it's like, that phrase, failure is not an option. That's bullshit. Failure is always an option. If it wasn't an option, why would we even be trying? Right.
Well,
so
I think it's even deeper than that, Tony, when it comes to failure. I think failure is about, you have to be willing to fail, right? Like the willingness to fail. Like if you don't strive for the absolute best, like willing to not get that money from that job, or willing to allow someone else to have it, and willing to accept whatever the outcome is, that willingness to, and then yeah, to I don't know what the word, I'm losing the words here, but willingness to fail. Because if you don't try, then you can be safe, right? Just don't make a decision or don't do anything. Don't do stuff, right? Then you're not. But the more you try, the more you're going to succeed. But the more you like the Babe Ruth analogy, right? He struck out a lot, but he also had the most home runs.
Maybe risk is a word in here. Is it willing to fail? Ooh, I don't know if I feel like I am willing to fail. I am pretty much unwilling to fail, but I am willing to take an awful lot of risk to apply, to pursue what I believe in. But I really have no interest in failure.
If you miscalculate and you get a consequence, it's as a result of a failure. I don't think failure has to be viewed as a bad word. It's maybe there's a different word that wouldn't be equated with I don't know, but anyways, that's what it's, because if you accept risk, you accept that something bad could happen. Hopefully it doesn't, but if it does, you still have to be willing to accept that too. I mean, that's the whole point of it, right?
Well,
I mean, without it, you can't have success without failure, right? You can't have, you know what I mean? Like it doesn't, you can't really have that. Like Babe Ruth didn't, like Wayne Gretzky didn't, he missed 100% of the shots he didn't take, right? He didn't make all the shots. So was that a failed shot? Well, technically, but maybe use a different term, but he definitely took it and he was hoping it would make it, but it missed, but he didn't stop shooting or swinging, so to speak. Right. And if you were afraid of that, like you missed so many times, you stopped shooting, well, then you're definitely never going to hit the net anymore. Right. That's where that willingness comes in, I think.
Yeah, that's a good way to say it. How do we define what failure is?
Yeah. It's and I don't even know how we got on this right now. It's something you said, Tony. It's your fault. You spun that disco ball just the right way. Well, it's interesting. How I'm curious how you would. If you have ever, or if you do, or if you've ever thought about, if you've drawn any parallels in your own life and how you live and how you interact from trees to how you interact with the human forest, how the tree forest has taught you lessons of how you interact in the human forest.
Interesting idea. I think there's a lesson in there. I don't know how well I've done implementing it, but something we were talking about earlier strikes me as recognizing the intrinsic or inherent value of an organism.
Mm.
An organism in particular, as opposed to just a thing, right? A log on the ground is a thing. A tree is an organism, right? And what is the intrinsic value of that organism to other people, to the environment, to the ecological system that it is part of? Not just what is its value to me. And I don't know if I can really apply that. Or, not that I can't apply it. I don't know what all that means when we think about people, right? What is a person's intrinsic value to his or her community, family, etc., versus what is that person's, call it, relationship or value to me? I've been thinking, I think a lot about people and relationships and leadership and communication as a business owner, right? And having, I feel stupid saying either 7 or 8 employees, because I can't keep track at the moment, and I haven't done the math recently, and it's a really small number. At 2 hands, I could count 7 or 8. But thinking about how do we interact with people in recognition and respect for their intrinsic value, their intrinsic humanity, rather than merely seeing them as an employee, right? As a human resource. I mean, that's the most dehumanizing word out there, right? You are a human resource. Well, it's like you are analogous to a can of fuel, right? Or a truck or a saw. That's a fairly stupid way to look at it. How do we look at the people around us? How do we see them and interact with them as people? Just as how do we make decisions about our interaction with trees in our landscape, in our community, by recognizing they have intrinsic value, regardless of my own individual relationship to them? I don't really know where it takes me, but it's what struck me with your question, Dwayne.
Well, how about, as you were talking, I thought maybe I could have phrased it better and even help myself understand this. Because I ask a lot of people this, and it is a difficult question, I think, or it's definitely one that creates ponder. But how do trees do it? How do trees recognize each other and the forest?
There's an interesting question. So, Susan Simard, right, the mother tree, and I think for those of our listeners who haven't read the book, talking about tree relationships to one another and mycorrhizal connections, fungi and the soil connections, and are trees competitive or not, right? Do trees share resources? Getting to maybe a more localized example, the idea of a living stump, right? Why would energy resources be given to a stump? That's a very interesting question to me. Now, the little asterisk on this, right, is there's been some contention around whether or not Susan Simard's findings are truly correct. I think there was a recent article I saw on that, and I have no opinion. I'm not the researcher. I'm just an arborist. But this idea of how do we communicate with one another? What is our sensitivity or awareness? How do we share resources? Or is it really survival of the fittest? Do we live in a world, a society, a community where we can allow others to fail? What is the parallel in human relationships compared to ecology as a whole? That if we look at a woodland, right? If we look at a forest, not a planted tree farm, but if we look at a climax forest with ancient trees and young trees and failures and snags, how do we define failure, right? Just like we were asking, is a tree dying and falling over failure, or is that just part of a natural process?
Mm-hmm.
And then as I walk down the street or drive, my business, our shop and office are in a light industrial area in North Seattle. We drive down the street and we see, women on the corner, and we see, people, curled up, in a comatose state, and people, unhoused. Is that a failure? What responsibility do we have? How are we sharing resources? I don't know how to parse that relationship. Is there an equivalency there? I don't know. I really don't know. It's an intriguing thought process, though.
Yeah, well, and it's that's exactly kind of my idea with the whole concept of talking about, or creating the tagline of this podcast, even the podcast itself, and why we end up in these somewhat esoteric conversations at times with people, because I go there, and I guess in my own way, I'm searching for that. Like, what can I learn? Because I feel like, if you just look at a tree individually, how a tree deals with wounding. What can I learn about how a tree deals with wounding in my own life? Because I think there's some real powerful parallels. How wound wood is actually stronger than the wood that was present at the time of injury, and how wound wood only is created until the wound is sealed, or no longer, even if it doesn't seal, as long as the tree doesn't recognize it as a defect anymore, it no longer produces wound wood. It changes back to regular wood. What a beautiful analogy to how maybe we could, that there's, like, as far as hope for restoration or healing from pain or suffering from abuse, whatever, from a time when you were on the street or whatever, like, that's just one example. So my quest in some ways is to draw from others their thoughts and feelings about how they've drawn parallels like that, or if they have, whether it be from trees specifically. You mentioned the mycorrhiza. What an amazing thing! Like, Shigo would quip. It's possible that trees are the woody extension of fungus. Yeah, we think fungus are secondary to the tree. Like, the trees are, well, they also have to do this stuff with fungus. It's like, well, no, fungus do this stuff with trees. Because we don't see all that's happening under there, and that this is the almost the crux of the whole what Susan Simard talks about, Dr. Simard. So that I don't have an answer for it. I feel like there's so much we could learn if we were to explore it, and and we delve into it all sorts of different ways, by being anthropomorphic, by valuing a tree and saying, look, it's not messy, it's a tree, you're messy. Like we protect, and we have these feelings, and yet when we broaden it out to each other and the whole family of the world, trees included, where do we all fit into that, and do we draw parallels into that? Is I like to think, part of it got me thinking about this was Dr. John Gathright stuff with the tree hab, where he'd have individuals that had suffered abuse that couldn't talk about it, but they could go in a forest and say, that tree's like me because, and they could finally talk about their issue, but not about themselves. They'd say, this tree is like me because of this. And I found that fascinating, and that's just another way we have this human way trees can give us some insights, maybe, or in forest bathing, people go to the tree and find solace. They go to the forest or a tree and they find respite, they find comfort. These are human qualities that I don't know. I think people, I do. I don't know if maybe I'm the only one. Anyways, I've been rambling here a little bit. I should pass it on. But I'm genuinely on a quest for it, and I've pondered the idea of writing about it. I'm not there yet, but I think the trees are there to teach us a lot that we haven't opened our eyes to yet.
Well, there's somebody much smarter than me, and I'm sure many people have said that you can, you can measure a society by how they take care of their most vulnerable. And I am sure that human civilization, human society has what do I want to say, strong parallels or behaves under the same rules as the greater environment. But we have to be able to see the picture broadly enough to appreciate those similarities. I'm trying to think of who described it. It was talking about levels of organization and disorganization, and that as you change call it the focal distance or the level of magnification, a subject under observation, say in a microscope, goes from seeming very organized to very disorganized. That if I look at the carpeting in my office from, 4 feet away from it, the pattern looks quite organized. If I get down to, say, 4 inches from it, it starts to look messy and have a bunch of dirt on it and look shaggy and ragged. But if I then get down to looking at the weave of the fibers, then all of a sudden it's organized again. But then if I zoom in even more, I can see that there's all these little, whatever they are, microorganisms and dust mites and small microscopic debris. But then when I get down to an atomic level, all of a sudden it becomes organized again. And that concept of what is our, I don't know whether the word is magnification or focal distance, are we looking from the right distance or looking with the right magnification to see the organization or disorganization in a system?
Perspective.
Better word.
Maybe. Mr. I'm going to defer to our resident philosopher. We will consult the oracle. Tony, that is you, yes.
I'll say something witty, but I don't know what it is. No, I don't. There's a lot to think on. All I know is the best comment when someone tells me their tree is messy. I'm like, yep, that's why we keep the big ones outside. And I just like, yep, that's what I do. And I don't let the big ones in the house. They're just way too messy.
Well, if I were to make I don't know, maybe this is a leap, maybe this is just jumping back to what we were talking about and mycorrhizal and connections between organisms, between trees. I suspect there is a parallel to the human condition in that I believe the pain and stress of people around us exerts a cost, a drain on us individually and societally. And I say that without blaming the people who are in those situations, but rather to look at the potential cost of helping rather than ignoring. And I imagine that in an ecological, environmental, mycorrhizal relationship, that an injured, weakened, stressed organism is a drain on those around it. And that there is a balancing that takes place, whether it is, some intelligence or just automatic biochemical response. And I would suggest, or at least in my own experience, I think I am learning that if we ignore those in pain, those who are less fortunate around us, it ends up costing us more than if we try to help them. And I would suspect, though I could never prove it, but I would suspect ecological relationships actually tell us something similar.
It could be. Yeah. I like that thought. And also, what's caused the causal agents, this speaks to two topics that are quite deep. But, you drive down a boulevard that have new, caliper trees of 4 to 6 inches, 3 inches. And, it was a bad winter, and, between the snow removal and the salt and everything else, what's wrong with those trees. And the trees are displaying, they're standing on the street corner suffering, right? They're laying in a ball curled up, and we know why. We don't question it. And yet people will ask us, what, like, man, we keep planting these trees every year and they just keep dying. Well, it seems so obvious to us, right? But yet we could look at a person like that on a boulevard and not have any clue.
Yes. Absolutely. Without restating exactly what you just said, Dwayne, yes. I mean, so often in a residential tree care setting, we're called for a tree that is grown. It's been in the landscape 10 years now, and it's 6 or 7 inches diameter, and it's tipped over in a snow event. And any qualified arborist could look at it, realize it was still root bound in the ground. It went from a plastic pot to a clay pot. And now it has tipped over because it failed to establish itself, right? It failed to build roots. It failed to build that underground support structure.
Correct.
And it's perfectly obvious it had no chance to succeed, but it's easy to blame the tree, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Rather than to look at the care that was given or not given when it was small.
And maybe that's where, as clear as that parallel can be to us and to trees and humans, and our understanding that roots, once they start, that process can't be changed. At least I think that's the current belief system around it, more or less. After enough time, it just doesn't. Maybe that's not necessarily the case with people. We don't have to draw the analogy right to the nth degree, maybe. But nevertheless, there's maybe something that can be offered in the way of understanding. And the other thing that when I said it touched on two things, I find it fascinating. I was recently asked to do a talk on ancient trees, or they wanted to call it a veteran tree forum, which was interesting in and of itself. And we ended up talking about even that, the term, but, and then it was a beautiful site I had where they had a memorial forest that had plantings, that had gone back for 70 years. So the very first trees that were plaqued and planted in memorial were reached a status that would actually met the criteria that various institutions have for what qualifies a tree to be veteran or ancient or historic or whatever, right? But the newer ones weren't big enough. They weren't, but the other ones 70 years ago weren't any bigger than these ones, but they didn't have the same, that, and I find that fascinating. At what point do you, is this tree going to become, because they don't get to be 100 without being 10 first, and yet I don't look at a boulevard tree and a young planted tree with the same awe and respect. I don't feel the same sense of wonder and what did it see? Once if it's older than me, I give it a different respect, which is just fascinating to me. Where that's a human construct, I think.
Well, we relate to trees in such funny ways, and I apologize, I only have a couple of minutes left, but you reminded me of something, Dwayne, which is I often get asked, how old is this tree, or what is the normal lifespan for this tree?
Yeah.
And in most situations, how long is it going to last is longer than you're going to live here. Yeah. And often it is longer than we're going to be on this planet.
Yep.
And I wonder what is behind that question. And I wonder if it is thinking of trees as something that are temporary around us, whereas human civilization, this is permanent. And we think about that time scale of the universe. And what did I hear recently? And maybe it was in this Bill Bryson book. And somebody, Carl Sagan or whomever, had described the lifespan of the universe, or the duration of the universe, as being a person's arm span, fingertip to fingertip. And a certain amount happened all the way from the left arm up to the sternum and to the right shoulder and to the elbow. And that human time, the percentage or portion of the life of the universe that includes humanity, is on the tip of a fingernail and could be removed with the single swipe of a nail file out of this whole wingspan of time. And we think of ourselves and we see ourselves as so permanent. We see our society as forever and trees as temporary. And there's nothing more back-asswards than that perspective. Yeah. The trees will outlast us, whether this tree in my yard or not. They'll be here long after we're gone, and they'll be happy that we are.
Well, maybe they'll miss us. I'd like to think they'll miss us.
Right. I often wonder if they're trying to get rid of us, and I wouldn't blame them.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, it's been a great chat. Like we said at the beginning, we don't necessarily know which way it's going to go, and that's what's fun about it. Tony, do you have any closing remarks? I know Craig's on a timeline here, and we appreciate all the time you can give us.
I can ask you this. Craig will enjoy this question. So if you could have just one billboard, everybody in the world's going to read it, what would it say?
Great question. I guess I would say, try seeing the world from another perspective.
Good answer.
Guys, it's been a pleasure, and I hope I get to see you in person here sometime soon. Thank you for the opportunity.
You're welcome, Craig. Thank you very much. Thank you. Sharing your thoughts and taking time for us. Thank you.
Best to both of you and your families.